In this introduction, I want to provide a broad context for your further discussions about leadership, changing organisations, and the need for organisations, for corporations, to be much more kind of proactive, to be able to cope with change in a much more planned way. And particularly I want to emphasise how the modern corporation, the modern organisation, whether it's public sector, private sector, whether it's a government institution, or whether it's a privately owned corporation, they share a common theme in that they will have to be much more flexible, much more agile, much more adaptable in their practices than they have been in the past. So what I want to do is to give a general overview of the changing kind of global environment within which institutions of all kinds will be operating in the future. I want to give a particular attention to the next 5 to 10 years, because we're going to be ahead of the game. If we are going to be high-performing organisations, whether we're private sector or public sector, we need to be thinking ahead of the game so that we can plan for that end game, mobilise our resources through developing effective leadership styles. Okay, so I'm going to look at the broader perspective. I'm going to look at that broader perspective by reference to changes in the global economy, firstly, and to make some comments about how I think this global environment is going to change and how it's going to impact upon Africa, countries within Africa, how it's going to impact upon Nigeria and institutions within Nigeria. Having done that, I'm then going to look, after looking at this economic situation, I'm then going to make just a few comments about the ways in which the global political environment is becoming very different. It's becoming very challenging. It's become very challenging for political institutions, for democracies, for parliaments all over the world. And then after that, I want to move on to our third issue, which is to look at changing demographics, the ways in which the demographic profile of the world is changing, and how that demographic change is going to have, again, a very significant impact upon the world in which we live. Not only in terms of internal migration patterns, but also in terms of international migration, and also too in relationship to the use of natural resources, the use of raw materials, many of which are finite, and many of which are going to become exhausted over the next few years, such that we're going to have to be thinking much more seriously than we have at the moment. Although there is some discussion, we have to think much more seriously about issues of sustainability and how we can substitute some of the resources we've been using by other renewable resources, sustainable resources, if humankind is to survive in the longer term. And then after that, I want to say a few words about technology. Of course, we're continually talking about the ways in which technology is changing our lives, and of course it is. It's changing our personal lives, it's changing the ways in which societies operate, and it's of course fundamentally changing the ways in which organizations operate. If we think of any organization of today compared with just 5 years ago, say nothing of 10 years ago, and again, whether we're talking about a private sector organization or a public sector organization, technology has had a fundamental impact in terms of how we do business, how we relate to our colleagues, to our fellow employees, and of course how we deal with clients, citizens, and customers of our different organizations. And having given this, so that's my general overview. And having given this overview of the economic, the social, the political, the demographic, and the technological, I want to then say, I want to really ask one fundamental question. A question which is really, what does this mean in terms of our organizations? How do we respond to these macro, global, intercontinental, national organizational trends? And I will just raise a few questions in relationship to those issues, because really they are the basis for discussion, because quite simply, we don't know the answers. And the whole purpose of this seminar and this whole week of discussions is to work through some possible scenarios in terms of answers to these questions and how, in relationship to these answers, we can then go away and apply some possible answers to how we as organizations can transform ourselves, reinvent ourselves to be ahead of the game and to meet those future challenges. So let's move on to looking at the first item on my agenda, which is the changing economic situation, the changing global economic situation. And I suppose in many ways, it's not very good news. If we look at global economic growth over the next, I would say, 2 or 3 years, looking at the data prepared by the World Bank, provided by OECD, provided by various think tanks, provided by IMF, there seems to be a general consensus that the global economy will grow by about 2% next year or through to 2013. There's not going to be much growth, less growth than we've been used to, certainly up until 2008 when we had the financial crisis. But if we disaggregate that figure of about 2%, then we find that the mature economies are very bad news. If we look, for example, at the Western mature economies, if we look at the OECD economies, they're unlikely to grow by more than 0.5%, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6% over the next year or so. Economists talk about 0.4, 0.5. I take these things fairly dubiously because these national figures that are collected are derived from surveys that are completed by organizations, and the degree of accuracy is such that in the completion of these surveys that the aggregate data that is prepared for national economies I don't think is that precise. But I think we can agree that, that the mature economies of the West, plus Japan, won't grow by more than 0.2%. So where's the growth coming from? Well, the growth is coming from primarily from the emerging markets, and indeed the frontier markets of Africa and South America. But primarily from the emerging markets where, by drivers, of course, the BRIC economies, that's Brazil, Russia, India and China, but particularly the last 2 countries, India and China, will have growth rates, continue to have growth rates that are a bit slower, a bit lower than they have been over the last decade, but even so, economists will be surprised if the Chinese growth rate falls much below 7 or 8%. And equally for India, that the Indian growth rate will fall much below 6 or 7%. So quite significant growth in those 2 major national economies. And remember, the population of India is 1.2 billion, and the population of China is 1.3 billion. So we're talking about 2.5 billion people in these 2 economies. So their growth rates are quite significant in terms of affecting global growth as a whole. And what I think is fascinating, and what sums up the ways in which we do have a remixed global economy, that's what I was going to say, a remixed global economy, is that if we look at global mergers and acquisitions, that is one company taking over another, up until 2007, the predominance was Western corporations buying up and acquiring corporations based in emerging markets. Since 2007, that process has changed. We now have a pattern where corporations based in the emerging markets of the world, based in India, based in China, based in Brazil, based in Russia, are buying up corporations in the United States and in Europe. Chinese companies, for example, now own Volvo and Saab in Sweden. Chinese company, Lenovo, bought up the manufacturing facilities of IBM, of course, and now they manufacture computers. And again, the UK automobile industry, Jaguar Land Rover, is owned by the Indian Reliant Corporation. So what we have is this kind of reversal in terms of an overall kind of trend that was predominant up until 2007. Now, emerging markets are continuing to grow, and they're growing not only because of their increasing competitive advantage of their manufacturing capability and their lower cost structures, they're also growing on the basis of, according to many observers, and as far as China is concerned, an undervalued RMB. The Chinese currency, according to the Americans and many other economists, not just those based in America or American politicians, the Chinese currency is undervalued, giving unfair advantage to Chinese-based manufacturing corporations, such that Western-based corporations with our higher cost structures can't compete. And this undervalued Chinese currency and this very significant competitive advantage this gives to Chinese corporations means, of course, that Chinese exports continue to be buoyant, and this means, of course, that China has acquired quite considerable financial reserves, financial resources, and many people argue this has been the cause, the major cause, for the global financial crisis that we've been experiencing now for the last, 3 or 4 years, since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. Why should this be? Well, the argument is like this, that Chinese government, its sovereign funds, had so much in reserves, it had to do something with its money. Chinese population didn't spend, Chinese population saves. So Chinese banks and the Chinese government has incredible financial resources. What did it do with these resources? It bought American government bonds and it made loans to Western-based financial institutions. So suddenly, up until 2008, you had a situation where you had very cheap credit available in the Western world as a result of the surpluses created by the success of China in world markets. And this money was lent to people. Banks were on their big bonuses, and banks took increasing risks. And it generated the subprime housing market in the United States, and it led to a big credit boom for consumers in the Western world. And then, of course, the whole thing crashed. The whole thing crashed. Banks overlent. Bankers got their bonuses through lending and hitting lending targets. And we had, therefore, the outcome of that was huge toxic debts, as reflected by the collapse of the housing market in the United States, the collapse of the housing market in Dubai, and in the Costa del Sol in Spain. Property as an asset, which had attracted so much of the speculative money, suddenly collapsed in the late 2008, 2007, 2008, 2009, and we're still living with that repercussion. And this financial crisis, of course, this banking crisis, has led to a downturn in the Western economies, because the banks, confronted with bankruptcy, confronted with loans which could not be repaid to them, what is their solution? They stop lending money. They stop lending money to corporations. They stop lending money to householders. They stop lending money to people who want to buy their own houses. The outcome of that, of course, is economic recession, economic downturn, and we are living still with that effect today. And particularly, as far as Europe is concerned, it has led to the euro crisis. We have a situation with the Eurozone, which, in my view, has always been unsustainable. You cannot have a common currency. You cannot have a common currency like the euro, which is a common currency for countries of very different economic competitiveness. What the euro tries to do is to allow companies in Italy, Spain, Greece to trade with the same currency as companies in Germany and in France. And of course, companies in Greece, Italy and Spain are not as competitive as German companies. So they go bankrupt. But we now have this Eurozone crisis. We now have huge kind of government deficiencies in budgets, and now those budgets have to be corrected. We have these Eurozone crises. Now, will the euro break up? In my view, it should. Or not entirely, but what should happen is that Italy, Greece, Spain should leave the euro, and the euro should primarily be a currency for France, Germany, and the smaller economies of Austria and Finland, because those small economies are competitive. But the whole crisis with the euro has a huge knock-on effect for confidence in the world's financial markets. Because we should not forget that the Eurozone and the euro currency, the Eurozone, is the second largest economic bloc in the world in terms of GDP after the United States. So, okay, China may be growing rapidly, India may be growing rapidly, Brazil, the BRIC economies, Russia, the frontier economies, some of the economies in Africa, which I'll come to later, may be enjoying very significant growth. But even so, the size of their GDPs is relatively low, even that of China, compared with the Eurozone of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the other countries of today. So, to sum up this first point about the economic situation of the world today is full of great uncertainties. Full of uncertainties to do with currency fluctuations, uncertainties to do with balance of trade between countries, uncertainties in terms of the future of the euro, uncertainties in terms of the value of the Chinese RMB, uncertainties in terms of, therefore, of the value of the dollar and the utility of the dollar in this very remixed global economy, the utility of the dollar to continue to be a reserve currency. My feeling is that after 2015, certainly in the next 10 years, we will have a new world currency, a new world reserve currency. The dollar has done its job. Of course, 50 years ago, sterling was the world's currency, taken over by the United States in the 1930s, 1940s. It's done a good job. But it no longer reflects the economic power, the economic clout of the changing economic circumstances of the present-day world. And I suppose that's reflected in the fact that the G7 is now evolving into the G20 group of nations, because that G20 group of nations now reflect countries that account for 80% of the global economy. Nigeria is not one of those at the moment. But the aspiration in Nigeria, as I understand it, is that by 2020, Nigeria will have the 20th largest economy, will be one of the top 20 largest economies in the world, and it will then take its rightful place. I still find it very surprising that it hasn't already, with its huge resources, its highly talented, resourceful population, why it hasn't realized its potential and is not already a G20 country. But I think that will come. I think that will come because of indeed, the seriousness attached to seminars of this kind and the ways in which kind of business capabilities are developing so rapidly and with big transformational effects for different organizations in Nigeria. I'd like to say a few further words about the economic situation, shifting away from the present crisis, if you like. And that is that if we do look at the world economy today, then we have to take into account the fact that commodity prices are becoming a very significant factor shaping economic welfare, economic activity. Obviously, of course, the price of oil is very significant here. And here in Dubai, of course, the price of oil and indeed the demand for oil is the driver for what we see around us if we look out of the window of this seminar room. But the worrying thing, of course, is that we're likely to run out of oil. What happens then when we run out of oil, when the oil runs out? Because it's been argued that we have something like 35 years of oil left, although further discoveries will be made, but we are beginning to peak in terms of our oil production. Equally so with natural gas. Many experts claim we have 75%, not 75%, 75 years of oil left, 75 years of natural gas left. And what happens then when we run out of natural gas, we run out of oil? There's plenty of coal available still, 200 years worth. But what does that mean in terms of our commitment to climate change and sustainability? But what is, I think, highly significant, and it's going to become more and more significant through the 21st century, are food prices. The price of food, as we know, the price of wheat, the price of corn, is increasing at an enormous rate. And again, that's being driven by China, by India, by these two major emerging markets adopting Western dietary patterns. This is good news for countries in Africa. I read a report only recently, last week in fact, which suggested that Africa, taken together, could be a major exporter of wheat by the year 2020. What we have at the moment is very big investment by particularly Indian companies actually, buying up large areas, large tracts of land, and applying modern irrigation techniques, fertilizer techniques, and increasing the yields of corn production, wheat production, very, very significantly. The report I read referred basically to East Africa. Now, whether there are such initiatives in Nigeria, I apologize that I don't know, and I don't know whether indeed the land is suitable in Nigeria for wheat production, but you would know better than myself. But also too, we have to bear in mind, I think, how in Africa, which economists sometimes refer to as frontier markets, markets which are growing and developing very rapidly from an agricultural base, are growing rapidly, not just because of agriculture, but because of the discovery of increasingly of raw materials. Raw materials are the kind that are used in high technology, that are used for making used in cell phones and inside computers and things like that, which I don't understand. But these raw materials are at a high premium and therefore are enabling companies in Africa to flourish. But this again brings us back to China, because China is becoming increasingly involved in developing infrastructure projects in Africa, not so much in Nigeria as far as I know, but particularly in East Africa, is being engaged in infrastructure projects in return for having access to commodities, having access to raw materials of this sort. And equally so, being very much involved in similar sorts of ventures in South America. So the economic drives, if you like, the political. And when China becomes more and more engaged in economic activity in South America and in Africa, all kinds of political repercussions, of course, follow from that, just as the increasing economic clout of China has a major impact upon the role of the United States, has a major impact upon the whole military set of forces in the world, and a huge impact, of course, on global politics. Further point about globalization, which I like to refer to, or rather, further point about the economic situation that I would like to refer to, is by reference to the whole situation of globalization. We've talked about globalization now for years. Any MBA student will have been writing essays about globalization since the early 1990s. But what's interesting is that despite this, it still hasn't happened yet, really. It's been predicted that at the moment, something about 12% of all trade is cross-continental. But it's predicted by something like 2020, this figure will double. And again, China will account for something like 25% of world trade. I keep referring to China, but when I refer to China, what is continually in the back of my mind is why not Nigeria? Because if China can grow so rapidly, as it has in the last 20 years, if you think of China 20 years ago, or even India 20 years ago, we wouldn't have the situation that we have, we would not conceive of the situation that we have in those two countries today. So why not Nigeria? In India today, IBM are embarking upon the biggest investment in their history. IBM is investing $7 billion in developing a knowledge center in India. This is not call center stuff. This is not routine data management stuff. This is high knowledge hub, research and development, working on new software, working on new products for the future global marketplace, drawing upon local talent. India has more graduates in information technology than the whole of the UK population of 70 million. India produces 1 million graduates in information and communication technology every year. That's the interesting one about India. Why not Nigeria? Equally so too, the Indian government is committed to abolishing poverty by the year 2020. And here it's grasping the capabilities of technology, of mobile technologies, of flexible technologies, of handset technologies, smartphone technologies, for the purposes of education in the villages, for the purpose of training in the villages, for the purposes of developing new skills in the villages, for the purposes of developing and rolling out health programs in the villages. I hope such ventures are being pursued in Nigeria, but I read about them in India. I know not whether such ventures are happening in Nigeria. If they are, I'd be excited to know about it, and as I'm sure many other people. If we turn our attention to China, China now has the second biggest spend on research and development in the world, only after the United States. It is now a world leader in nanotechnologies, miniature, minute technologies. Scientists and engineers that emigrated to the United States are now returning to China. Can you believe that? Would that have happened 10 years ago? Engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs can now make more money in China, returning to China, than they can in the United States. Now, if India and China, why not Nigeria? And if India and China can do this in the past 20 years, why not Nigeria in the next 20 years? And I think that's an interesting discussion to have. You know, what can we do? What can we do in terms of our personal skills, in terms of our organizations, in terms of our businesses, in terms of our private sector corporations, our public sector corporations? What can we do in order to make a difference that in the year 2020 we are one of the biggest, in the top 20 biggest economies in the world? Globalization, therefore, increase in the growth of trade between nations, between regions, between continents, has led to the creation, of course, of global supply chains, which has been enabled by the rationalization of transportation systems. It's no good having manufacturing facilities in China if you can't then get those manufactured goods shipped over to Europe, the United States, and to other markets. That shipping's got to be done in a reliable, predictable, logistic way. And the containerization of transportation, the development of standardized transport containers, which enables therefore great volumes of mobile phones or kind of the latest technologies in terms of TVs or washing machines or other household goods in a predictable way to be delivered from the manufacturing facility in China to the retail stores in the United States and across the rest of the world has been absolutely key to this process of globalization. But what is also key to this process of globalization, and what it's also done, is that it's led to a restructuring of the international division of labor. We probably think of globalization in terms of actually it's a process which is driven and really taken into account and really only affects major corporations, the great automobile corporations of the world, steel corporations, and things of that kind. But not entirely. With these global supply chains, what we find fascinating is that small businesses become incorporated into the global supply chains of large corporations through their subcontracting facilities. Because of the transportation systems that I've already mentioned, because of information and communication technologies, internet technologies, major corporations can call upon the resources of small businesses around the world in order to produce their final finished goods for consumer markets. And they do this because small businesses, these small subcontractors within these global supply chains, are cheaper, more cost-effective, and more efficient than larger corporations in their own home countries. But not only that, what the internet world has done is made small and medium-sized businesses, given them the capability to become international businesses in their own right. I'll give you one example. I had a former PhD student of mine. She did her first degree in the United States. She's from China again. She did her second degree, did her doctoral degree at my university in the UK. 25-year-old woman from China. One day she phones me up from China to say she had a business idea. I said, what was that? She said to me, well, when I was in England, I noticed that people drank a lot. And I said to her, yes, I've noticed that as well, particularly on a Friday and Saturday night. In fact, I said to her name was Ping, I said to her, well, Ping, it seems to me not only do they drink a lot, they drink far too much. So she said she had this business idea, which was that she would like to be able to export and sell in the UK gift-wrapped wine bottle openers, corkscrews, wine bottle openers. Did I think it would work? Well, I said I didn't know. I couldn't commit myself. She would have to do the market research. So anyway, she did. And today, Ping now exports to the UK gift-wrapped corkscrews, wine bottle openers, which are sold throughout retail stores in the UK. They are manufactured in China, they're shipped over to the UK and sold through a major retail store. Ping has three resources to do this. Three resources in running this international business. One is her mobile phone. That's one resource. The second one in running this international business is her laptop. And the third one, the most important of all, is her imagination. Her imagination to see a business opportunity. Now, the key thing about the entrepreneur is that the entrepreneur sees the business opportunity, and she's an entrepreneur. And lots of entrepreneurs in China. You can have degrees after degrees after degrees. You can produce scientists and technologists forever. Unless they have the imagination to create wealth out of their ideas and their innovation, then you do not get business startup and growth. You do not get economic growth in the economy. Now, when I've been to Nigeria, I get the impression, not just the impression, my experience is, of a population which is incredibly resourceful, incredibly entrepreneurial. So there are obviously constraints at the national level, the state level, the community level, which somehow inhibits the releasing of this entrepreneurial imagination, which could, if it was released, have a huge impact upon economic growth, have a huge impact upon economic growth and the general prosperity, job creation, of course, of the Nigerian economy. I'll come back to that later, if I may. So, to finish this point about kind of the economy, yes, the global economy is being restructured. Yes, the global economy, parts of it are in crisis. The whole thing is being remixed with the shift of economic and political power to the emerging markets. The Western world, perhaps, has become essentially countries of consumption and lifestyle, and no longer countries of production and economic wealth creation. So now let's turn our attention to the second item on my agenda, which is that if we have these political forces at work, what's the likely outcome for the political agenda in this very remixed, changing kind of global economy? Well, it follows, and it goes without saying, of course, that China and India will become more and more significant, become more and more important. Equally to, of course, Russia. And Russia is showing its strength, showing its clout with greater rigor as its economy has come out of the chaos of the 1990s and has sustained its growth through the last decade through its economic, through its, I'm sorry, not its economic, but through its oil production, through its export of other natural resources, including, of course, natural gas. And again, I'd make the comparison with Russia and Nigeria. You know, if Russia is able to turn itself around since essentially 1990, well, no, not since 1990. You had chaos in Russia through the 1990s. If Russia's been able to turn itself around in the last 12 or 15 years, then why not China? Why not Nigeria? Because other people don't do it. They don't do it. We do it. We are all empowered with the capability of transforming our organizations, changing our communities, changing our public sector and private sector organizations in order to create wealth and improved welfare in terms of education, health, and economic well-being for all of our citizens. And this, as in India and China, is occurring in Russia. But if we look at the global political scene, again, rather as with the economy, I think there are certain worrying issues. The worrying issues are, I think, linked back to the fact that in the past we had political stability and we now have political instability. China challenging the United States. China getting increasingly engaged in the global kind of political game. But also what I would say too is that another major force of instability has been the collapse of the old Soviet Union. Okay, there has been the creation of new democracies in Eastern Europe, but they have been the source for lots of for the development of lots of corrupt regimes, for a lot of kind of migration of populations and so on and so forth. But particularly, I think if you ask me to signal two countries, or two areas which are a major concern, one is Iran, with its developing its nuclear capability, but that has to be looked at within the context of the Middle East, and of course the whole relationship between Israel and Palestine. And the other area, of course, which we welcome, is what's been referred to as the Arab Spring, which last spring led to the overthrow of the despots of Tunisia and of Egypt, and of course then of Libya. But generally speaking, and researchers have demonstrated this, they've documented it, if we look at it historically, when you have the toppling of regimes, you have great celebrations. A new dawn is here. But the great celebrations often lead to excessive expectations. They assume somehow that if the despot has fallen, we're all going to suddenly have jobs, we're going to be very wealthy, we're going to have great lifestyles and so forth, great ways of living. But that doesn't happen. So what follows from the great celebration is then a period of unfulfilled expectation and therefore resentment. And out of that resentment, of course, follows protest, social conflict, social tension. This is, of course, what happened in Iran 30 years ago. And this, I think, is highly likely to happen in these so-called new liberated states in the Middle East. And was certainly the case of what happened in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. Another area of political stability, of course, of instability, another period of political instability, another area of political instability is, of course, India and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and how the superpowers are being drawn into that whole situation. So I'll say no more about the political sphere because I'm not an expert in that whole area, but I mean merely to demonstrate how All these things impact upon creating cultures of uncertainty, and they provide an environment within which businesses have to operate, and businesses do not like uncertainties. Organizations in general do not like uncertainties. And I think a major factor, which I think is significant, is that the world today lacks a major international agency that can impose its stamp in an authoritative way. And here, of course, I'm referring to the United Nations, which in terms of its charter, in terms of its aspiration, in terms of its rhetoric, should have the capability of resolving a whole range of disputes, etc. But of course, as we find with border disputes within Africa, where we often have ethnic rivalry in Africa, as recent history has shown, and equally so in the Middle East, we find that the United Nations is relatively powerless in handling these kinds of issues. Let's move on to the third issue on my agenda, which is demographics, which is something which I feel I know something more about than politics. The world's demographics is undergoing a huge transformation. Sorry to keep using this word transformation, but it really is, just like the remixed global economy. Only 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, certainly the end of October, beginning of November, the 7 billionth person was born in the world. The world's population now consists of 7 billion people. That's a lot of people, and compared with, shall we say, 50 years ago. But wait for it, because in the next 40 years, that 7 billion is projected to increase to 10 billion. By 2050, there will be 10 billion people on the planet. And this, of course, has huge ramifications, particularly because most of the population increase is in the poorer regions of the world. The poorer regions of the world, the developing countries of the world. And this, of course, puts on the agenda something I mentioned already, that is food and food production. It puts on the agenda other resources, like energy. It puts on the agenda issues to do with water, an acute shortage of water, if we look at the future global economy. And it puts on the agenda a whole general set of issues to do with urban infrastructure and infrastructure in developing economies. And I've been reading recently about Atlantic City in Nigeria, the city that's being constructed outside Lagos, which strikes me as very, very exciting. This project that helps to protect the coastline around Lagos, but will offer a fantastic environment in a sustainable manner for something like 400,000 people, strikes me as a very exciting way to handle population growth and to handle all the other problems of overpopulation that we witness on a daily basis in Lagos, but equally so we find in the major cities of other developing countries in the world. Because if we look at population increase in the developing countries of the world, it generally leads to the growth of these enormous cities as people migrate from the countryside to the towns, putting on the agenda tremendous challenges in terms of the demand for resources of one sort or another, but also offering a whole lot of opportunities. But a whole lot of opportunities in terms of how do we establish governmental systems for these cities, for these urban environments? How do we provide the infrastructures? Should it be privately funded or publicly funded? Business opportunities there for entrepreneurs, of course, in meeting for the needs of these growing urban populations and the growing middle classes, making Lagos, despite its congestion, in my experience, a very exciting city, and other cities in developing countries, in my experience, very exciting, very dynamic. But at the same time, we can't disregard the huge poverty you find in Sao Paulo and areas of that kind. Urban areas which encourage, of course, a whole lot of illegal activity, drug dealing, drug barons, and all those sorts of things. And as well, of course, political graft, etc. So the demographic kind of revolution, again, this huge increase in the world's population, will have a major knock-on effect for our governmental institutions, our policing systems, our authority systems, education, health, You know them all, so I don't need to spend more time discussing them now. But on the other hand, what's fascinating about the world's demographics is that the population increase is in the developing countries, is in the countries where we have the dynamic economies, and therefore we have a situation where in these developing countries we have young, productive populations, which is in contrast to in Europe and in Japan, where, as I've already mentioned, Europe is rapidly becoming a place of consumption, of lifestyle, rather than of production. And that's reinforced by the aging of its population. The population of Europe is getting older and older. There are more people over the age of 65 in Europe than there are under the age of 16, for example. The population is getting older and older, a shortage of young people, and this is having a huge demand on welfare and health services in those countries of Europe, as well as, indeed, increasingly in the United States. And also sapping, I think, the entrepreneurial energy of these economies. It is, by the way, this demographic, this aging of the population, because it does mean when you have an older population, of course, they need to be looked after. In the absence of family structures and community structures, they need to be looked after in hospitals, in care institutions. Older people tend to be ill more frequently. So the demands on welfare systems, on health services, are much greater. And it's another factor that accounts for the budgetary problems Western governments have, which is now currently being tackled in the austerity packages within Eurozone. Each of the countries in Europe have raised their retirement age. The retirement age has increased from 65 to 66 to 67 and so forth. So kind of a divided world between the old aging West and the young, rapidly growing populations of South America, Asia and Africa. And I suppose I've mentioned already, as I have, how demographics on these trends, demographics will have big impacts on trends in terms of the use of water, the use of energy, and those finite resources which we're going to have to be more careful that we use in the future. That brings me on to kind of the two remaining topics in my agenda, which is the social and the technological. Just a few words about the social. Societies are not what they used to be, with economic outcomes that stem from that. We have the collapse of traditional authority, and I don't think that can ever be re-established. You know, family, community, age, religion don't have the same impact today as they had in the past. But a major factor which is changing, I think, social and power relationships in societies is indeed the impact of social media. Protest and democracy is more and more shifting from the political arena. Traditionally, we saw politics, we saw our influence on government as a way whereby, by voting, by lobbying, we got our political representatives to pass laws in Parliament which, one way or another, would benefit us as citizens, to improve our communities, to improve our ways of life, to improve the quality of our lives for our families and for our children. It is now, because of social media, the internet and social media, it is now only one mechanism of influence in our society. In a world now with Facebook, in a world with BlackBerry, in a world where social media is now so significant in people's lives, there are other avenues of protest and organisation which have very real effects. I've already mentioned one. The Arab Spring, the downfall of the dictatorships in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Libya were very much driven by internet technologies. People taking photos with their smartphones, putting it on the internet, sending it to their friends, sending it to their communities, their contacts, and so on. It was a real mechanism of mobilization. To give another example of this, the London riots, which you will have read and indeed seen on television last summer, not just in London, but in other cities in the UK. Again, a key organising process in those riots was BlackBerry and social media. People were told where to meet, how to organise. Within social media, there were certain influential guys who then had influence on others. And so this whole organisation of social movements means that, through technology, means that the whole political process, which parliamentarians used to be able to control, they can no longer do so in the ways in which they could in the past. Which brings me on perhaps more directly now to looking at technology. Again, another surprising figure. Okay, 7 billion people in the world today. In the next couple of years or so, there will be 3 billion people on the internet. Already there are more mobile phones in the world than there are people. And the internet is having a major impact, as again you will know as well as I, on the ways in which we can provide education to people in villages, whether it's India, China, Nigeria, other countries in Africa. It enables businesses, as I've already mentioned with Ping, to set up on an international basis, to deal directly with their customers on a one-to-one basis. It enables public sector organizations, governmental institutions, to interact directly with its citizens, with its clients. It enables us to provide cheaper, much more cost-effective public services. Technology, social media, the internet enables us to totally revolutionize our public sector organizations. That's what's been happening in the private sector. But whichever country we look at, we find that the revolutionizing, the transforming capability of internet technologies for providing better services to clients, for providing cheaper services to clients, is not being realized. Whether it's the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, any country in Europe, and my guess, any country in Africa. And you can see how in Africa perhaps the demand, the need to use internet technologies, not just for education purposes in schools, in rural areas, but for things like kind of interacting in terms of health treatment, by virtue of the fact that people can monitor their health condition and then send it through. Self-administered health, as in Japan, which has developed quite significantly. But also, too, we can see how the internet technologies can have societal transforming effects in the ways in which clients interact with their governmental institutions. But more than that, just again, a very minor example, a very significant factor in reducing corruption in Afghanistan has been the mobile phone. And you may wonder, what is he talking about? How has the mobile phone enabled corruption to be reduced in Afghan society? It's quite simple. That up until recently, before the mobile phone, or with the mobile phone, people got paid money, soldiers, the police. But so much corruption in that the guys who were paying the money were taking their cuts, that guys stopped being committed, stopped being effective policemen, stopped being effective military. Why should they bother? But what's happened in Afghanistan has been the introduction of mobile banking. And once you have mobile banking, the ability to corrupt, to take a cut out of the person's salary that is due to him, gets immediately eliminated. And again, you can see the possibilities and the potential for this in different countries around the world, in all countries around the world, in fact, if there's the willingness to get rid of corruption, to get rid of graft, as you get so often in so many parts of the world. Mobile technology is one example, but also we can think in terms of how the payments of pensions, how the payments of benefits of one sort or another could be done through mobile technology, smartphone technologies, etc. And I could say much more about that, and I would if I was here for our discussions, but I'll move on because I think the general point that I'm making is made. So what does this all mean? This macro set of processes that are affecting us globally, nationally, regionally, and locally. What does this mean for our organizations? How do we, as organizations, private sector organizations, public sector organizations, publicly accountable organizations, what does this all mean to us? Well, of course, can't give a straight set of answers to that. It depends very much upon your own particular organisation, what services you're delivering, what heritage and tradition you come from, what are your values, what you want to aim for, etc. and so forth. But having said that, I think there is one or two very common general points one can make, which is that management and bureaucracy are no longer enough. We need leadership. And what do I mean by leadership? I mean leadership in that people who have a vision, people who have a vision, people who know what they want the organisation to become. Why do we have this need for leadership? I think it's never been more important. And I think I've already mentioned the reasons for this. One is because of the increasing risks and uncertainties that we face. We can no longer manage certainty as in the past because there is no certainty. If you have certainty in the wider environment, if you're a government agency or a private sector organisation, if you have uncertainty, if you have certainty, you can create bureaucratized processes because you can deliver tomorrow as you do today, and then the next day, the next day, the next day, you can have a nicely, clearly predictable process which you can then manage. But if things are continually changing outside, if the risks are continually changing, how do you manage the risk? How do you set up risk management strategies? How do you continually adapt and modify within the parameters of your risk management strategies in order to ensure that you are an adaptive, responsive organisation? Another need for leadership, I think, is because we have to make, in this context, decisive decisions. We can't allow our organisations to become paralysed by bureaucratic discussions, by groups of committees, by groups of managers where no one is making a decision. People have to take on the responsibilities and be empowered to take on those responsibilities to make the decisions. But also within my discussion of leadership, I would also include another two key factors here, which I think is lacking so much in so many countries in the world. And that is the need for clear, transparent corporate governance, which we certainly don't have in many organisations in the United Kingdom, and which you certainly don't have in China or in India. There is an absence, generally speaking, of corporate governance, of ethical, clearly visible, transparent corporate governance. I didn't mention the United States there, but I should, because the United States is particularly in need of transparent corporate governance. And of course, this has become very much a significant item on the agenda of debate in the Western world because of the whole banking crisis, the ways in which bankers have been paying themselves huge bonuses, taking irresponsible risks, but they've been able to do so because of the availability of cheap money up until 2008 for the reasons I mentioned in terms of Chinese economic growth. And what do we do with this money? We give it to American banks and let them lend it to people who can't possibly repay the loans, but they'll also pay themselves high bonuses by achieving their credit targets and so on. Corporate governance, I think, is a real major issue. And linked to that, I think, to corporate governance, is if we are to be ethical in our businesses, in our business practices, is that we adhere, we comply to good international standards. International standards in terms of accountancy procedures, international standards in terms of reporting processes, international standards in terms of our operational techniques, in terms of operational processes. And I'll tell you why there's a very important factor and a reason for this. And that is it's not just an ethical issue, a moral issue. It's also back to the Facebook generation. By that, the Facebook generation, young people who use social media. And young people who use social media are constantly observing what's going on within their organizations as employees and also not as employees. As I speak, there's an occupancy outside St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The police have just broken up an occupancy in Wall Street in New York by young people protesting against the lack of ethics of modern capitalism. Because in the past, we would perhaps think about the lack of ethics of modern capitalism, but that's a moral issue. You may think it's ethical or unethical. It's for you yourself to discuss. But what happens now with social media? It's so easy to communicate and get in contact with other people who share the same view. And then on that basis, just as with the Arab Spring, just as with the London riots, get together and establish and make protests. So companies now that do behave unethically, that do contravene international standards, that don't have transparent, clear corporate governance, are in a sense setting themselves up for real problems in the future, both in terms of their employees, revealing what's really going on, but also in terms of employee morale. People do not like, young people particularly, young talented people, do not like working for unethical businesses. And you may think to yourself, well, yes, but they give them a few years and they become unethical. They don't just naturally become unethical. Businesses make them unethical. The cultures of businesses make employees, as they work within the organizations, either ethical or unethical, depending upon the extent to which they adhere to international standards and also to transparent, clear, generally agreed corporate governance procedures. And that's all part of the leadership role as I see it. It's all very much part of the leadership role as I see it. And I think, just very, very finally, on leadership, okay, it's about setting the values, setting the standards. It's about deciding where we want to become, what we want to become, what we want to achieve. It's an incredibly motivating process, that. And that's what entrepreneurs are very good at. Entrepreneurs are able to energize their staff. And it's easier in a small business than a large one to energize their employees, to go for that common goal, to have that passion, to have that excitement, and then that drives the business forward. Employees come forward with continuously new ideas, how we can develop new products and services, because we want to become this kind of business. That's how Google operated, that's how Microsoft in the early days, that's how Facebook. I can refer to my own business, which I have in London, which is a software company, which equally, it doesn't want to make money, which is nice because we don't make much, but it's driven by a passion to make a difference in terms of what we do, providing management education online so that people continually update their skills. But ultimately, in terms of, for you, coming very much now to yourself, in terms of this changing kind of global environment and the restructuring, the transformation of your own organizations, how do you take on the leadership role? Okay, you do all those things I've mentioned, but essentially remember that leadership is all about a relationship. Leadership is about empathy, understanding, it's about admiration and respect. And you only get the admiration and respect from the people who report to you, from the people who you work with, if you empathize with them, if you can see the world as they see it, and if you can develop how they see the world into a way in which you and they can agree on seeing a world of the future in which they want to be placed within an organization which they want to be part of, in an organization which will look like this compared with how it looks today. And in order to achieve that organization of the future, we agree we need to do this. In my view, that's what leadership is all about. Understanding, empathy, working with our colleagues, motivating, inspiring them, taking them towards the goal that we and we together collectively want to achieve. Well, that's a very quick review. I hope you have a great course. Sorry we haven't met up today. Unfortunately, I have to leave. I have to go off back to Scandinavia early in the morning. But enjoy, and I hope I've raised some issues which will be the basis for some discussion. Challenge me, disagree with me, but please have discussion. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's just over an hour. That's what he said, hasn't he? Cool.